So in terms of a games approach to coaching, I'm going to define it kind of in this way. I recognize that people are going to define it in their own ways or kind of attribute their own specific meaning to what this is. But for the purpose of today, what I'm talking about is really any approach to practice and development that uses the game to teach the game. Now, some things that kind of are attributed to that. Those skills remain mostly in the context in which they're typically performed. So what we're contrasting this to is maybe more 1v0, 5v0 individual skill type practice. That's what I'm kind of contrasting this to. Okay, these are practices or developmental tools in which the context is embedded in what's happening. There's a really large emphasis in this on making decisions. It's emphasizing that the decision is part of the skill process and not removed from it. And then kind of part 3, which plays into that role too, is it inherently involves both sides of the ball. One thing I do want to point out is I view this as a continuum. So there are things that are extremely game-like, which is the game, and there are things that are extremely kind of singular, devoid of decision-making, devoid of defense, that are on the other end of the continuum. Throughout a practice, I feel like you move through that whole stretch. But one thing that, as I was reflecting on this, is it's kind of funny as we move to kind of emphasizing a more of a games approach, and at the same time over here in particular, we're talking about how players play too many games. And I think that there is kind of needs to be an understanding that, okay, well, that's down the very, very far end of the continuum, playing of the games. Those are often devoid of feedback. Those are often devoid of constraints and some other things that are inherent to kind of approaching development with this style. So why would you want to do this? So I think there's kind of 2 reasons that are often cited in terms of why people use a more games approach style. The first one being transfer of the skills, being that doing it in a way where the context is inherent to what's going on. Hopefully that leads to greater transfer and better performance when you arrive at the game. Your players are hopefully able to adjust to things a little better, those kind of things. And probably the second one that's cited the most, and we might talk about that a little bit later towards the end, is just the concept that it's more fun. And I think it's definitely more fun to coach. I think it's a more challenging way to coach. But we'll kind of tap into that as we continue. Do we have any questions, Jared, just yet, or kind of?
Yeah, we've got a couple.
Yep.
First question.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on when to use the on-air drills, the 5-on-0, 2-on-0, like you said, compared to the advantage, disadvantage? Or if you're going to talk about that later, then more.
Yeah, like I'll tap into that real quick right now. I think that that where we probably use kind of the let's say the more individual drills or what people might think of skill-based drills, most commonly would be we do a lot of volume shooting still that would be probably in that setting. We feel like shooting is a skill that you can really develop, and we've shown that at the college level, players often make really big strides with access to facilities to shoot more. So I would say that's one element where we do a lot of shooting that may be devoid a little bit of its context. The second one would be where there are what I would call like a critical skill deficiency. So something that may fall in that boat is something that would be maybe footwork related, in which case an inability or a lack of ability to perform a certain task as it relates to their footwork may get in the way of the next steps of decision making and those other things. So at times we will kind of peel back and do some of that work, whether that be more in an individual setting or within a practice even, taking some time to go through that. But that would be one element. And then I think some other elements would be related to maintenance of body and fatigue. So within the context of a season where we're practicing a lot, we're playing a lot, the games approach or something where there's offense and defense may be a little bit too demanding at a point in time. And so we may need to to kind of weave in a little bit more individual skill work just to keep that going. And probably the last one, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, is I think that, and I'm learning this as we go a little bit more, just how important confidence is in this process. And I think at times you need to be creative about ensuring that the players see success if they weren't necessarily seeing success in a game's approach at times. So kind of plugging them in little scenarios where they can feel that success, gain confidence from it, would be kind of one approach. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Coach.
Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to touch on is just kind of what our style of play is, or how I would describe it. So kind of we use 3 words to more broadly describe, and I understand it's kind of a bit token and catchy or cliche. We like to say that our program wants to be a program that shares, shoots, and stifles. So inherent to that is that we want to move the ball, and we want to be a really unselfish program. We're probably not the type of place that just because of how it works is going to have a 25-point score and a bunch of 6-point scorers. We need to be able to kind of carry the load across our group. We want to be great shooters here. Obviously, that's kind of the master skill, and we feel that's something that you can really develop here, and we want to emphasize shooting the ball and having the confidence to do so. And then the stifle piece is kind of tapping into the defensive side of the ball and making things hard for people. Some background. So when we came in out of this program, as I said, we just finished year 3 here at Davidson. Coming in, they'd only won 6 games the previous year. They just moved to the Atlantic Term Conference, I believe 4 years before that, from a more regional conference back in the Steph Curry days. And that created some challenges with where their talent level was at and where they're at that point in time. So when we came in, we were actually picked preseason last in our conference, 14th in our conference, down the very bottom of a range of categories. And the shooting one was one I'll point out where this light's going off on me. But the shooting one, we actually, the year prior to getting here, the program was the 2nd worst 3-point shooting team in the entire country. So we are talking 350th out of 351 schools down the very bottom. We thought that was a bit of an indictment of Steph Curry that they were at that point. So we felt like day one, that was something we needed to improve. And I'll talk real briefly about just the success we've had with that. But by the end of year 2, we moved from them being essentially the worst offensive team in the conference to us being the number 1 offensive team in the conference, to breaking our school record in threes made in a season, leading the conference in assists, and a range of categories that we were hoping to kind of be high in. So I think what was really cool is this wasn't a case of where we just brought in our players and we were able to kind of do things that way. We were able to train some kids that maybe weren't brought here for this purpose to do these things. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to how we go about practicing and developing them. So this kind of image of kind of hieroglyphics is kind of the next point of one thing we feel very, very strongly here about is terminology and language. And kind of the reason I put kind of this Egyptian hieroglyphic thing up is obviously it's not something that everyone understands. And so a language that is specific to our program we feel is really important. Our men's program here that's kind of had some amazing times with Coach Bob McKillop over the last 32 years, also have very specific language with how they approach things. And we were talking about it the other week, and we feel that this kind of specific, almost secret code about how you approach things just leads to this culture of buy-in, leads to this culture of ownership about what it is. And we feel like this is really important. So I'm going to do my best as we go through the rest of this talk to use some of our language as well as probably more common basketball terms. But Jared, definitely flag me if anyone's like, hey, like, what was that word he just said again? We have pretty much words for everything, and most of them have been attributed by us to what that is. I think as you're thinking about the language and terminology you use, I think things that are very short, that are descriptive where possible, and that can be verbs are really helpful to that process. And I'll talk about it a little bit as we get into our offense, but having these short words that can then combine together is really important. And then adding to that, when you're in a scenario where you're using, say, a games approach to coaching, where maybe your drills look different every single day. And I think that's one attribute of a games approach, is you're not saying, hey, we're doing this drill. It's like, hey, maybe we're in this formation and this is what the constraints are. This is what we're doing. And an important thing is that you're able to communicate that quickly and clearly in a way that your players understand, so you can actually get into it and get into the meat of the activity rather than explaining the drill for 10 minutes. So I think that's really important. We'll kind of talk about some of that as we roll along. So in terms of the style of play, we want to be the best team in our conference at what I would say kind of loosely as playing basketball. So what exactly does that mean? So we want to function at a very, very high level in what we call the play after the play. So that requires a strong understanding of the concept of what an advantage is and then how to keep it. I know it's kind of gone around the last year, and we've used different terms for this, but the concept of dominoes, where once an advantage is created, that these dominoes continue to fall. There's not people being sticky, and we're able to keep that advantage going is kind of an idea that that we've definitely kind of utilized in our 3 years. What we're hoping for is obviously this leading to high percentage and open shot attempts. And I kind of mentioned before about shooting being kind of this master skill, or being something that we feel we can develop. We feel like if we can get open shots, we can make sure that kids can hit open shots. They can get on the gun in their own time. They have an ability to do that as much as they potentially need to. So our goal is, and as should everyone's be, is to create really nice open looks. We kind of have the concept that we want to have playmakers and not play runners. So as I go kind of through the next piece, we have kind of a motion offense. There's a bit of a hybrid of some different systems, and the keys are completely with the players with that stuff. So we can definitely give some triggers or some words or constraints to what we want them to run, but ultimately it's what the players are doing and how they're doing it. All 5 players on the floor are kind of involved in all elements of this. So through our practice, everyone, whether it's our 6'3" kid or our 5'5" kid, are doing basically the same thing for the most part, with some different elements. And then I think in the college setting, there is this unique kind of contrast within winning and development. And you guys are probably in scenarios where you're almost exclusively in the development mold in terms of youth basketball. And obviously, as you get to national championships and senior level stuff, the winning becomes a different element. I would say for the vast majority of the college programs over here, they're focused on the winning component, not the developing component. And I think we want to be a program where our players continue to want to play basketball after they're done here. But also the development within a system. When you have a system and you develop players within that system, you're going to get better year on year. And I think that's something that we're trying to utilize. A couple more images down the bottom right-hand corner, just in terms of what we kind of use for our players. Kind of got a volcano there, and we talk about the lava. So we feel like spacing is really important. The lava would be anything inside the 3-point line. We want to get out of the lava pretty quickly if we've entered it. So that's kind of one phrase we use. And then the second one that kind of plays into the role of the dominoes and things is the visual of putting the defense in a blender. So we really like to kind of see our opponents scrambling, chasing things, and that kind of visual context. And so we use that with our players a lot as we're watching film. Like, have we put them in a blender in the scenario? Have we disturbed them? Have we perturbed them in that environment? And I think one thing as we think about this too, kind of college basketball is probably the most scouted kind of version of the game as it relates to the skill of the players. So obviously you've got the NBA, there's a lot of scouting that goes on. Everyone understands things inherently. Skill of the players a lot higher. Here we've got 4 coaches. Everyone's got 4 coaches that sole responsibility is to find a way to beat an opponent. So there is some elements of it. It is pretty hard to create some advantages at times. So we feel like once we have created an advantage, we want it to be the best we could possibly be at that. Some offensive principles to play off this. Spacing's key, a kind of question or a little bit of a rhetorical question, but do you have names for every location on the floor that you're going to be referring to, and do those have meanings to players? As I mentioned, we tend to have some relatively specific words that respond to actions that happen with our offense that we refer to as positions on the floor. At the core, players should understand the principles of how the ball moves and kind of when the ball moves, how to move when that happens. General tenet, if you have an advantage, keep it. If you don't, try to create one. And that kind of comes into the concept of understanding what types of advantages there can be. So I've listed a few here. So obviously a numbers advantage. So maybe you're thinking more traditional kind of fast break setting for that. Long closeouts is something we talk about a whole bunch within our context, trying to create long closeouts and then play off those long closeouts. Kind of put can't guard yous. So that might be you got a defensive player that has no business trying to guard you. That's often in our context, probably on the low block area that we would utilize that. Maybe that's a switch. Maybe that's something like that. We don't try to generally beat too many kids off the bounce. If we have that, we try to move the ball and play off closeouts a little bit more. Now, pace could be an advantage. So maybe you've entered an action before a defense was fully ready to comprehend and guard what was going on. And then the last one I put is kind of the surprise component. I think the reason I put a question mark on this is I think talking to our players over the year, there's probably, and for whatever reason from the youth basketball context, there's this element of plays or actions or things that they do on the basketball court, maybe being a surprise to the other team. And maybe that's, hey, we're going to like run this play and we're going to get this look and these kind of things. And I would challenge the notion that anything on a basketball court is truly a surprise. Like obviously there is ways that you can enter something more quickly or this kind of thing. But as you move on with stuff, the ability to actually make the correct decision is the appropriate thing. It's not that you've surprised someone with it happening in the first place. So we like to kind of use the analogy of the game of basketball, at least the decision-making process, being a game of rock, paper, scissors. And I know kind of rock, paper, scissors is something that a little bit in vogue down there. I read the Basketball Australia report where I guess you're going to potentially start some games that way. But kind of what we talk about in the rock, paper, scissors concept is that as an offensive player, you essentially are playing rock, paper, scissors with a defensive player, but the defense has had to show their hand first. So you think of it this way, you're across from someone, rock, paper, scissors, they've thrown rock, you just have to choose correctly. The timing of that's a little different. There's going to be a wrong answer. So if they chose rock and you chose scissors, not good. That might be a turnover. That's probably not ideal. They choose rock, you choose paper. Now you've maybe used a shot fake, gone by them, created the next advantage. Someone will got ourselves a bucket. Okay, you choose rock, they choose rock. Now we're in a scenario where there's just no advantage created. Maybe you were a little sticky with that ball, and then we have to find a way to create a new advantage. So we kind of talk about the clarity of decision-making in that way a little bit. Now, kind of all of this is within the framework of what we would call our swing motion offense. For those kind of, and obviously you're all probably familiar with kind of the flow offense in terms of European ball screen or that style. Ours is similar to that framework in a way with regards to positioning and spacing, but there's a lot more layers to that. So we're not just dribble, handoff, roll, rise. Like that's not what we do. We have a series of numbers that refer to a variety of actions. So anytime the ball hits the trail spot, our wing on the side that the ball did not come from, so we call that our hit guard, and they're located in what we call the hit spot. They're responsible for the offense from that point. So they get to call a number as it relates to who's in the action, as it relates to maybe some constraints we've given them heading into a game. These are some good actions for us to run, and they are in control of that. Now, we could call some numbers, so we could come out of some timeouts and say, hey, we really want to run a 1 into a 3 if we can. We really want to be hunting 8 action right there. And within those numbers, there's then going to be inherent a bunch of decisions that they can make, a bunch of reads, and a bunch of things that can happen. So kind of the way we look at it is that our offense is combined into numbers, counters to those numbers, and then what I would call interactions. And with the interactions, I talk about fires, smokes, and gets. So fires are our term for dribble handoff. We feel like it's really hard to say dribble handoff, DHO, all these different things. We call them fires. Simple as that, okay? Because we call that fires from day one, we decided to just call our ball screen smokes. So anything that would be considered a wing ball screen is considered a smoke. And then in the past kind of year and a half, we've incorporated gets into that action as well. And I know that's becoming more in vogue through international basketball. Big fan of that action with our players. So it's kind of our offensive principles. So based on that, our players must therefore be able to have the skill to make open shots, be able to have the skill of playing on a string, so avoiding 3 in a rows, and then the skills of making plays off the catch. So that would be decision 1. And then the skill of making the next decision as help defense rotates. We'd call that decision 2. These are things that we do have to do every day. So if that's what we consider to be our style of play, we need to do those every day. Now, if you look through those things and think to yourselves, what elements of that are stuff we could do in probably, and I'm probably going to incorrectly use traditional in this term, but say traditional skills training versus a more games approach. I think that there's a pretty clear answer to that. So the skill to make open shots is something that they can do a little bit more in a block type practice setting potentially. But the skill of playing on a string, avoiding 3 in a row, like that's inherent to needing defense out there. Defense is part of that 3 in a row. Decision of making plays off the catch. Okay, once again, defense is out there for that. Skill of making decisions, obviously defense is out there for that too. So if those are things that we need to be really good at, we've got to do them every day. That's going to be kind of where we approach things next. Any questions here, Jared? I'm going to grab a sip of water.
Yeah, Coach, we've got one on your culture and programs, common language.
Yep.
What did the process look like when you came together as a staff to figure that out? Was it as easy as the head coach coming up with it? Was it work from the ACs, or did you guys just sit down one day and decide on some jargon?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we were kind of fortunate here in some way that we don't have summer school here. So when we got the job, it was kind of early May. We weren't necessarily having to physically interact with our kids until August. So we did have a fair bit of time, fair bit of runway to kind of talk about things and go through stuff. We were also fortunate that 3 members of our staff had worked together before, and my head coach Gail and I have worked together since our Wake Forest days, and we entered Wake Forest at the same time. And so we'd spoken about a lot of these things and how we would approach stuff if we had our own program. There were kind of elements of like we kind of knew what the style would be and kind of apply some language to the broad share, shoot, stifle point. But we literally sat down in our conference room, kind of meeting after meeting, and spoke about what we wanted to do, how we wanted to implement things. And we're just very specific about, well, what do we want to call that? And that was a very kind of open process. Everyone had input to that. I'm a bit of a brainstormer by nature, so like initial things I say might be pretty ridiculous, but eventually we come to something we all agree upon. And that's kind of how it's happened, and we've layered things as we've gone on with regards to what those are. And I think that where the layers have worked best is when we've had the verb component to some of the things that we do. So an example of that may be within our transition context. we have kind of a transition where people have roles, but those are not permanent roles. So someone fills each of those on a possession depending on who got the rebounded. We call our first post down the fly post. So they're flying, they're off. They're called the fly post. And then the language that's then associated with that is pretty easy. So we're playing out of the fly if we're going inside. And there's a range of other kind of ways we can combine that language. So that would be something. Having term for our locations on the floor has been helpful. So the hit spot, which I referred to before, we consider that free throw line extended and slightly below. So that's where we want our guards to get to, with a corner on one side. And so we're able to use language like hit, which refers to a baseline ball screen in that spot. So there's some different ways that we've used that. So I would say it's been a really collaborative process, Jared, and that's how we approach it. And I think that's the best way to make sure that it makes sense to a group and that we're able to then have alignment as we then go into coaching that on a daily basis.
Thank you, Coach.
So I'm just going to show a little film right now. Let's hope this comes through pretty clear. Just of some concepts with regards to how this this kind of then plays out in an on-court sense. I'm going to have to come out of this briefly. And is that better?
Yeah, we can see that now. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. So what I'm going to show now is just a series of kind of 7 or 8 clips as it relates to kind of the advantage after advantage stuff. So, and what I want you to think about as we're kind of showing this is what this then potentially means for how you are going to rep these things in practice. So here we have kind of a corner pass, a little screen away, and then a double gap here to drive into, create some help defense, drive kick, make that pass. Here we got a bit of a ball screen and a slip. Okay, drive kick, shoot the ball. Here we got a little hit screen, baseline ball screen, drive. Now we have a long closeout. We spoke about these long closeouts before. We're now able to attack a long closeout. I think the one thing to point out is like some of these kids are not that are going to be attacking these closeouts are by no means the most athletic kids. So this kid here, kid from Texas, is playing against one of the best kids out of Europe in her age group, top scorer from Belarus, really nice, long athlete, with the ability to play out of advantages. He probably could have shot that one, but kind of playing off the catch, really attacking. Here's a slightly different version, okay, where we've had kind of like a little bit of a soft show. All right, they've had to bite in a little bit on our post. Okay, now we're able to attack this long closeout and play. So we want to just kind of consistently reinforce these things. And I think the question would be, how would you do this if the defense wasn't out there? Here's kind of the idea of putting them in a blender. I hate to kind of make a point. This girl's Australian. She's from WA, but here she's spinning around in circles. Put her in a blender. So that's kind of, I wanted you to have the visual of that. Here, moving the ball, throw inside. She's an Aussie right there, Adelaide Fuller. Pick it out. Another example, what we'd say is kind of putting them in a blender. Kind of the next couple I want to show is just the idea of celebrating the intent of things. So as we go through with kind of how we approach stuff, what we find is really important is the language of great choice. So if you walk into one of our practices, if the thing that you hear most is not great choice, as coaches, we've had a really, really bad day. We need to be reinforcing those choices as we go. That needs to be 60% of what we say, reinforcing great choice, great choice, great choice, and explaining potentially in scenarios why a choice was not great. So here the idea is celebrating the intent. So in our film sessions, we're going to watch lots of this kind of stuff, right? Here, ball moves, put them in a blender, we're able to play off this closeout. You know what? We didn't execute the finish of that. We need to work on that a little bit more, all right? But celebrating the intent. Obviously, we understand how we want to play. Here, boom. Good, moving the ball. Attacking closeouts again. Moving the ball, find our best shooter. Okay, doesn't go in. That doesn't mean it wasn't a successful possession for us, right? Now, I posted this clip on Twitter the other day, and I know some people probably seen this already, but kind of we talked about the concept of kind of under pressure, we don't rise to the level of kind of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training and our habits. And what we do every day are these things. And And I want to show you a clip here and for some context. We had a lot of injuries as the season went on this year. This is a game late in the year at LaSalle, school day game, a couple of thousand kids screaming for LaSalle. We're down in this game. This is a pretty important game for us to be able to host a playoff game. And then this is 1 minute left. We're down 2. And this is kind of the type of basketball that our players defaulted to. So here they're attacking a closeout. We're moving the ball. We're sharing it. They feel like they've got an advantage. They try to keep that advantage. They feel like they have an advantage. They try to keep an advantage. Here we put them in a bit of a blender. Now we're able to get a wide open catch and shoot, wide open 3. So that's kind of like, I think just some concept of how we play, to then talk about how we then practice that. So I'll kind of go back into this one. So playing off the catch is crucial for us. As I spoke about, can't really do this unless there's a defense present. I like to use the terms 0.5 when I'm talking about kind of incorporating some of these elements into a drill or into a practice context. So there are absolutely times where you're going to do this 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, and they're having to flat out create their own advantage. We like to do that a little bit more from our actions, from our 3v3 setting. But to be really good at the play after the play, we have to practice that. So 0.5 to me means either that there's been a long closeout that's needing to be created, or there's already an inherent advantage to what's going on. So some people will use an offensive player with a defensive player on their back, side by side. That would be probably the elementary or initial step at doing this. So when we have kids come for camp, absolutely we're doing that. Maybe early days when we're installing some of this with our players, if we're really worried just about the decision on the back end, we'd work on that. But most of the times we're trying to put them in positions where they're starting with a long closeout and they have to play out of that. 1v.5 would be long closeout. They got to go finish themselves. A 2v1.5 would be where they're now having to encounter a help defender and play from there. A 3 would be that there's kind of probably 3 guards out there, or maybe a post player in there that has to move as well. What's really important to us, though, is what the micro skill that we're emphasizing on that day to move the needle. We always talk about moving the needle. So there's little categories that we would just want to kind of move forward, and how do we arrive at that choice? So that might be film-based. That might be based on things we've seen earlier in practice. So maybe we know that this is a block that we've got a third of the way in practice. Maybe we've done a little bit of a 5-on-5 segment at the start. The ball was getting sticky. We weren't making great kind of first touch choices, as a soccer term. And so maybe that's what we're going to focus on in our playing off the catch segment for that day. Maybe we're just finishing really poorly, so we're going to try to put them at an advantage, see how we can go about finishing. So that might be from film from previous games or earlier in practice, or feedback from our players. Hey, I'm having a hard time at this. And I think talking to your players about which pieces they're struggling with is really important. As said, the drill constraints are then manipulated to achieve those goals. So some aspects that you might want to focus on: finishing, the passing, the end of penetration decision, so maybe the footwork related to it, the actual decision, did I make the choice to the right player, and then manipulating angles and spaces at which they're occurring. So we saw before that in the film that we played out of that double gap, that might be a scenario where now we're playing off a low closeout, we're trying to play into that double gap and make choices out of that. That might be an example of, within our offensive context, how we then use the game's approach to then layer that in. So from that, I just wanted to kind of show you kind of a version of this drill, and this would be kind of our 3 versus 2.5 version. We'll often start with a coach manager at the top. We try to have all players kind of with a foot on the paint. You guys obviously have a slightly wider paint there, so you could adjust that however you wanted. Or I think depending on who you're working with, you may start them closer or further out depending on what time one needs to process that decision. So we then have an ability to throw this ball to anyone, and then they're playing out of that completely live. Within this context, we like to hunt 3s and layups. We are totally okay with someone shooting a body-to-body layup on someone. Contested layups is part of basketball, and we think that's really important. What we're not okay with is 1v2 shots. So scenarios where you've driven the hoop, maybe you've got someone in your back, someone beside you, someone slides across, now you're trying to finish on both those people. We're not real comfortable with that. So I think that's important to kind of define what type of shot you're looking for. We'll do this from a variety of contexts as well. So as I spoke about, we may put this coach in the corner. So on the 3-side corner, we may kind of make that little screen in version, peel back into that double gap drive right there as a version of this. We may do it from kind of a blast cut version, or we call that a lift from the corner with that 3. So they're having to work on their footwork and play off a dynamic catch in that setting. Once again, like with the game's approach, you're doing it whatever fits your system. And I think that's the important thing. I kind of mentioned this to coach the other day, and some coaches I was talking to about this. My favorite thing when someone comes and watches our practice is when I hear someone say, I didn't get much out of that practice. And what that means to me is that coach doesn't really get what we're trying to do, and they're trying to take a drill and implant that on their team. I think, and obviously that's then followed up with some questions of like, all right, like what offense do you run? How can you embed the concepts of what we're doing within what you do rather than the specifics of what we do? So I think that's really important. The game's approach is kind of limited only by your creativity. So I'm going to show a version of kind of how this operates in a more kind of big scale. And I think with part of this, this is the only practice drill I'm going to show. Wanted something for some coaches to take away as well in terms of having something you could potentially do in practice directly from this. All right, so here we've got, we call this girls game. And we initially played this 3v2 my first year or so here, and then had a unique situation where the head coach of the Charlotte Hornets, James Borrego, came to our practice. His daughter is 12 years old, came to our camp, had some great conversations with him about that. And we talked about other things we did, and we talked about incorporating this as a 4v3 game instead of a 3v2 game. And so we did it, and then 2 weeks later, the Hornets then did that at their training camp as well, and they use this regularly in their practice settings, or at least a version of this. So the reason it's called girls game is because back in the day, women's basketball, girls basketball, you weren't allowed to cross halfway. So they were thinking of the netball environment. Those were some constraints to how that game was played back then. So it's kind of a bit of a throwback to that idea. So I'm going to just kind of let this play. This goes for about a minute. Context, first practice. Okay, this is our first week of practice. The idea is that there is a 4v3 in each half of the court. We're hunting threes and layups. Once again, things are not always going to go well. We got to celebrate the intent. Okay, but they're moving the ball. This is a version where we're now hunting these things, trying to play dynamically, trying to make great choices with when to shoot the ball and when to do the next thing. Once a team scores or kind of shot goes up, the other team gets it, the 3 players in that defensive segment of the court then have to deliver the ball to their 4 offensive players down the other end. So this is a good scenario where maybe you've got a lot of kids on a court. We essentially have 14 players at once right here. We used our scout guys in this as the defensive players. But a good kind of opportunity here. We're kind of moving the ball. Very important to kind of practice our kind of how we move on penetration, how we align with things. Obviously, through this, you always have an inherent advantage. Kind of how we get out of the lava in this. Didn't like how Cash kind of put the ball on the deck. Just for your interest's sake, girl that just shot the ball, she's an Aussie. She's from Victoria. Girl that passed it to her is from WA. Lefty down the other end of the floor is from Queensland. And I think one thing that's important, you'll see Cass hit a bunch of shots in this, the girl from Melbourne. Cass didn't hit a single 3 the under 20 national championships, and I believe under 18 national championships either. And she's got to the point where she's shooting high 30s from the 3 and consistently like confident and ready to whack it. And I think a lot of that comes from the confidence that she gets from the way we've provided clarity. Rosie, kind of same thing, not really a three-point shooter. Her shot's terrible if you've seen it in terms of technique, but she's got to the point where she was 2/3 of the way through the season shooting at 45% from the three. And then kind of last thing, obviously, if there is a turnover, they're able to keep scoring down that same end. So this is a kind of version of a game we play. How we play it, we go 2.5 minutes of the same group playing together. We change the scoring regularly, so whether we want to incentivize or decentivize certain shots, we'll change scoring based on that. So maybe we flip it, the layout's worth 3 and a 3's worth 2, whatever that looks like. But we'll play for 2.5 minute segments, and the girls really enjoy this. So I just wanted to give you kind of a actual drill that you could see, because we haven't been able to be in the office. I haven't been able to embed too much other practice stuff in. But might stop there for a second. Jared, do we have any questions on anything we've gone through thus far?
I guess one of the biggest questions to get out of this, Coach, is when you approach and you use this games approach, do your games change per season, obviously, because different teams may show different flaws? Or do you just stick with the same games and drills that you've used season after season and then just kind of adjusted within those drills?
Yeah, so why don't I go, I'm going to go through, I'll show you kind of the next 2 slides, and I hope that I touch on it. And if I don't, definitely pull me up and remind me to answer that. So I think the next piece is kind of the install of offense. And really, this is kind of the basis behind most of what we do. So when you say, like, do you do the same drill games? I would say yes. From a broad perspective, very simply, this is a game we play a lot. But the constraints within it, the details within it are what changes on a daily basis, team to team. And once again, we're giving them the keys, right? So we're giving them the keys to call numbers, to make reads the way that they do. And so how a Rosie Deegan makes her reads, or what her strengths are within our individual actions, versus what our point guard from Reno, Nevada, who's smaller than her and is a little bit more of a kind of shoot first kid, their decisions are different. And so, like, within each kid, within each drill, the constraints are totally different. So we do a lot of 3v3 out of this formation, where a coach starts with the ball or a player starts with the ball in the setting. If we want to be 4v4 version of this, pass happens, maybe this is denied, maybe we have to use one of our counters to get into stuff, and then we're playing out of our number series here. I can provide way more detail if anyone's got questions with that at a future point. But that's kind of what I would say is the crux of, say, 30% of what we do is changing constraints within that context. So some things to think about. I guess I can go back to this one. Let's do this, actually. This guy. All right, so I think the things that are important to think about when you're kind of applying the constraints or rules, or however you want to view these things, to your game, is what is the context that you're altering. So do you want to give direction to the offense? Do you want to give the direction to the defense? Do you want to give it to both? Do you want to be explicit to either? And when I mean explicit, do you want it to be something where you've communicated with the defense and the offense has heard? Or do you want that to be something that they do without the offensive player knowing? And I think depending on your age group, depending where you're at with your team, depending where you're at with your install, that might be different. We may say, hey, the defense is switching, okay? We've seen the last, and within the game, that's what's occurring, right? Like, you're going to have played 5 minutes, you're going to come to a timeout and you say, hey, this is how they're guarding us, okay? They're guarding us this way. You now have to be able to make these decisions. So I think probably more often than not, some of those guidelines of what it's going to look like will be explicit to our players. Directions to our offense may be that we want them hunting certain looks. It may be that we want them playing certain numbers within our actions. We may want them focusing on certain versions of an interaction. So, like, hey, we're in this. The opposition is doing a really nice job of busting up our handoffs, making it really hard. Okay, so why don't we just go into our smoke action for this stuff? Okay, or they're really hawking the ball in these scenarios. why don't we play out of our debts and play out of that? So I think that that's kind of an approach, is giving some directions to the offense. Some of those constrained choices might be space and time. So you may say, hey, like we're in 3v3 with this. You've got to score on this first side of the floor. Like this is where it stops. Okay. Maybe we're like, hey, this is the end of a possession. We got 10 seconds left. Let's make sure we get something from that. I think it's also important to understand that there's game and then there's game-like as well. So that kind of refers back to the continuum that I spoke about earlier, that game is kind of rolling them out and letting them play a little bit more and not providing that much instruction, maybe not providing that many constraints, and letting them navigate that situation completely freely. Game-like to me is doing things that are obviously with the context still there, so the offense-defense component still there, but that we're looking to gain certain things out of that process specifically. I think that taps into the next point of like, what are we specifically coaching and what are we not coaching? I think we did we've done a better job as we've gone with this, and I think some of this was maybe a new way of coaching for a couple of our assistants as we went into things, but you can't coach everything in this form. And I think going in with the intent of what the purpose are, and it may be three things. You might be like, hey, what we're really focused on working on is like, if our spacing's not good, that's a non-negotiable today. If our decisions on a catch are not good, that's a non-negotiable today. And if we're not playing unselfishly, that's a non-negotiable today. Now, that might mean that you don't coach that you didn't like their footwork. That might mean that you don't coach that you don't like their end of penetration shot choice. So I think we have done a better job of being pretty specific about like trying to move the needle on specific things. And once again, if you see some stuff in practice that's not going well, maybe the next drill you do, you're like, okay, when we do our next 3v3 segment out of this formation, that's what we've got to teach the whole time. Or like, let's go back. And I would say we have a rigid plan of our practice to an extent, but we do have an ability to throw stuff in. Like, once again, we don't have court limitations like you guys probably have a little bit more of. So we need to go 5 minutes over because we need to throw in a playing off the catch segment to make sure that goes well. We're going to do that as well. And obviously some other things to think about are like what players are involved, how many, does the decision that you're hunting or you're trying to look for require 3? Does it require 4 people? What's needed? Like, what are you actually looking for maybe as it comes into the game that you need to prepare for, or the layering of decisions that you need. So obviously the younger the kid, probably the more space required, the less layers of decisions that they can then process. So I think that's an important piece. And then I use the term confederates there, and kind of from my kind of research days, the psychology department I used to work with talked about this a lot. What a confederate means in this sense is someone that you've planted. And so I think that one way of potentially doing this with regards to direction to the defense is giving certain tools to the whole defense. So like, hey, we're like switching this, we're doing that. But whether it's a scout player, whether you've got a coach embedded in it, whether it's a player that you can kind of trust to do the right thing, you tell them to make a mistake on a certain element of what they're trying to execute. So, because not all the time does a team that's switching switch appropriately, right? So if there's a scenario where you're trying to hunt certain things out of it, you could absolutely say, hey, like in this, we want you to like make a mistake at this point and see if we have an ability to self-correct or make the read based on that kind of constraint or decision-making process. Did that kind of broadly answer that question, Jared?
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. Okay. Thank you, Coach.
No problems. So format of practice, I know this is kind of probably the thing you guys are thinking a little bit is like, how do we then break it down? Once again, we have a lot of practices, and each practice is going to have like a slightly different distribution of some of these things, as it also relates to leading up to a scout or days before a game and this kind of stuff. But I would say a rough breakdown for a typical practice would be 20% on air. That may be 5-on-0, that might be 1-VO, that might be certain finishing series, maybe elements of a warm-up. I do think some elements of 5-on-0 is important, and I like to do it in the full court setting, because to me, the thing that translates most from 5-0 to real basketball is pace. Pace and appropriate spacing. So we definitely will use that to self-correct a little bit. Once you obviously have pattern recognition of what you want a motion to look like, then that process goes pretty quick. And it also, we use it as a test of our terminology and our language. So the ability for us to say, hey, like on this phase, we want you to run a 1 fire into an 8. We want you to throw the ball into the fly. We want you to run some away action on that entry. And then let's look for the smash. So the ability to almost test our language in that setting is another way that we would use what I would call on air or the 5-0 version. Then we do 45% of what we'd call three or less game-like type stuff. So that's kind of what you saw there with some of our action-based stuff. And then kind of about 35% of kind of true playing, where there's probably little coaching that goes on throughout the actual element. And when we play those 3 or less games, we have an ability to coach on the run in that. We'll often do that against our scout guys. So the next wave will come up. We'll then kind of coach those kids off to the side a little bit on some of the decisions they made. Once again, we're blessed with the fact we have 4 coaches on the floor at once that are able to see things, and we're able to get to plays pretty quick and provide real feedback. But generally, probably more generally speaking, the 4 or 5 player stuff, we'll stop that much less frequently. We'll let them play. Maybe we have 2:30 on a clock and let them play a series. Maybe we put 1:30 on a clock and we're working on end of quarter type decisions, understanding clock, time score, those kind of things. So I'm going to kind of go to just kind of what I think we need to do better. And I think from doing this over the past several years, and you'll notice I've deliberately put the emphasis on the offensive side of the ball in this. And I think that particularly in a developmental context, if you're spending anything less than 80% of your time on offense, I personally think your distribution's a little off. Like, players make increasing levels based on the offense that they can play, whether they can make a shot, whether they can finish, all these kind of things. So my personal opinion, that's a little loaded. That's the guys at which I'm going to talk about it through there. Now, we do use our scout guys a lot to play against. And I think one thing that we've learned is that this games approach, now we do play against ourselves a bunch as well, but this games approach can be as good of a teacher on the defensive end as it can be kind of on the offensive side of the ball too. And so we will kind of in this next season probably look to do a little bit more with our kind of players as the defense and less with our scout guys. Just kind of continuing to make great decisions as a defensive group and understanding how to limit advantages now that we've got to a point that we can do things. And that doesn't mean we're like scrapping our scout guys, but I think that's one thing to learn. And then I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I think that there's an absolute balance between the confidence side of this style of coaching. You are going to see a whole lot more errors, right? Like, inherent to playing the game is that shooting percentages go down, turnovers happen, these things go on. And I think it's just so important. And I probably haven't done the best job as I could at this. It's so important to remind you yourself of the importance of building that confidence and having an appropriate ratio of good to bad commentary as you go. And I kind of touched on that earlier with the great choice. Hey, Cass, loved that choice you just made. Love that. Okay. That is the most important thing we do versus correcting some of these things. Letting them self-correct a little bit, I think is pretty important. Obviously, there's times where you have to intervene from that setting, but I think reinforcing the good is so important when you're playing with a games approach. And I think that kind of brings me to kind of the last piece of the having fun piece. And having fun should be like a core tenet of what this is about, what practice is about, what playing is about. We've had some branding done in our gym, and have fun is plastered across the top of the practice gym for us to see when we come in. And I think that what I wanted to touch on here is there's a little bit of a misnomer with the games approach that it is just naturally more fun. I want to push back on that a little bit. Like, I think it's fun with an asterisk. What you need to understand is, and this is the case particularly for us in a college setting, but these players are coming to us with potentially 10 plus years of prior basketball experience. Now with that comes 10 plus years of exposure to coaching. And what they see as this isn't necessarily what they initially, when they come in, think coaching is. So the framing of things is very, very important. And helping them understand what the goals are out of certain things, understand the process, and that we're reinforcing those things appropriately. I think a failure to do so, what that does is it creates a contrast between the large success that they have in the more individual skill, what they maybe work on with their trainer, these kind of things, and what they do. And there's an element of like, you have to protect yourself from the fact that they don't think what you're doing is coaching, because they're not seeing that result. So I think consistently rewarding, emphasizing good results is super important. And then the other piece is understand that there are players that don't necessarily think something that is more demanding physically is fun. So I think building the practice around some of these concepts as well, individual players and how they approach things, is important. And maybe that's that you have to embed little shooting segments within the practice between some of these game approach things to kind of temper the mood at times, I think is important. So yes, it's absolutely more fun to play, to have a score and those kind of things. But remember that within the framework of someone's mind that's in that practice, that's not always the case. And I think that's just really important as it goes, because I do think that's something that's been pushed, and there's a big asterisk on that.